Policy debate is nothing new in Washington over North Korea, but you don't normally want to have it between your Secretary of State and the President.
The biggest concern for me is the continued muddied messaging coming from this administration on North Korea policy. We have to remember that the White House policy is maximum pressure and engagement.
The pressure strategy has to have an off-ramp. Right now, we don't see what that off-ramp is. At the current time, I think the prospects of talks are very low. They may have already written off this administration.
South Korean President Moon Jae-in was on a state visit to China this week. Can South Korea play a major role between the United States and China and North Korea?
We should encourage these dynamics between South Korea and China.
But I think that there is a concern in Washington that's likely to grow over time. If they start looking more and more to Beijing, then people in Washington are going to get nervous.
From the Voice of America, this is Washington Talk.
Hello, welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Eun-jung Cho. We bring you insights and analysis on North Korea issues every week from Washington, D.C. This week, we will first discuss Secretary of State Rex Tillerson's offer of talks with North Korea without preconditions. His overture was contradicted by the White House the next day. Is there a rift within the Trump administration on how to deal with Pyongyang?
We're ready to have the first meeting without precondition. Let's just meet. If there was any condition at all to this, is that, look, it's going to be tough to talk if in the middle of our talks you decide to test another device. So I think they clearly understand that if we're going to talk, we have to have a period of quiet.
The Secretary was not creating any new policy. Our policy remains exactly the same as it was.
Now, my guest today, Mr. Frank Januzzi, president of the Mansfield Foundation and former advisor to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Also joining us today, Ms. Jung Park, Korea Foundation Chair at Brookings Institution. She's held senior positions at the CIA and the Office of the Director of the National Intelligence. Welcome to both of you.
Good morning.
Good morning. Frank, let me begin with you. There were mixed signals coming from Secretary Tillerson and the White House, and there were a little back and forth going on. What is the bottom line? Does the Trump administration want to sit down with North Korea at this point?
Well, policy debate is nothing new in Washington over North Korea, but you don't normally want to have it between your Secretary of State and the President. At the current time, I think the prospects of talks are very low. The White House issued a statement essentially contradicting Secretary of State Tillerson and saying that now is not the time for talks. That really took the wind out of Tillerson's sails. I think he was trying to get some glimmer of hope on the diplomatic front, and now we have to wait and see what happens next.
Jung, is there a rift between Secretary Tillerson and the White House, or are they just playing good cop and bad cop?
I do think that there is a difference in opinion. We have to remember that the White House policy is maximum pressure and engagement. And while the White House seems to be emphasizing the pressure part, Secretary Tillerson and the State Department obviously are looking at more of the diplomacy part, the engagement part. So I do think that the biggest concern for me is the continued muddied messaging coming from this administration on North Korea policy, which I think is confusing to all of us and confusing to our allies.
It is the job of the State Department. You're so right. They're the ones who are supposed to turn the impossible into the unlikely on the diplomatic front. And so they're trying to do their job. But for them to do it effectively, their messages have to be taken seriously and credibly by Pyongyang. And I think that's the part of this that is most troubling.
Right.
Is the latest episode undermining Secretary's credibility to the allies or North Korea?
It's not just undermining the Secretary's credibility, it's undermining the U.S. credibility on this issue, to have different messages, or at least the optics of different messaging coming from this administration. So I think that's really bad in terms of our North Korea approach.
Frank, is it because Secretary Tillerson is being marginalized within the administration? Is he on his way out?
Well, he was never a close Trump confidant, and there's been rumors of his departure almost from the day of his appointment. I don't know whether he's leaving or staying, but I think more importantly, the people around the world don't know whether he's leaving or staying. And so I think all of them are allies in South Korea and Japan, are partners on the North Korea project in Beijing, they must be taking a pause here and saying, well, are we supposed to follow the Tillerson policy line, or are we supposed to wait and see what comes next?
Recently, around 60 former U.S. military leaders wrote a letter to President Trump to not pursue any military action against North Korea, but seek diplomatic resolution. What is telling about this letter?
On the one hand, such letters are relatively rare. Former generals like to stay out of politics in most instances. So for them to be mobilized and concerned enough sets off an alarm bell for me. It says that the professional military people are worried that we are moving toward a crisis on the peninsula. On the other hand, I think it's very telling that there are basically no good military options on the peninsula. But that doesn't mean that there are no options. Just no good ones, and none that we should prefer to a diplomatic solution.
And Jung, there's been a lot of talk about preventive war against North Korea in Washington, D.C. through many officials recently. What are your thoughts on that? Are there a lot of concerns, not only in the military leaders, but also in the academia?
There's a lot of concern, and I think it's really bad. There's no, as Frank mentioned, there are no good military strike options. And the National Security Advisor, McMaster, has talked about preventive war. Lindsey Graham has gone on the record to say that there's a 30% chance of a military strike. I think that letter of almost 60 military officers who wrote this letter against this the military option, I think it's another example of how alarmed people are in Washington and elsewhere about the possibility of a military conflict breaking out on the peninsula.
The pressure strategy has to have an off-ramp. Right now, we don't see what that off-ramp is. Where is the diplomatic strategy to complement the pressure strategy?
And going back to the talks, North Korea, ever since its missile launch, expressed several times that it actually wants to sit down with the United States. Would North Korea be eager to accept Secretary Tillerson's offer?
I don't think so. Given all the rumors about Secretary Tillerson's departure from the administration and the fact that the White House and his own spokesperson at State undercut his message at the Atlanta Council, in my view, I don't see how Pyongyang could take that seriously. And why would North Korea start dialogue with the Secretary of State if the rumors are that he's on his way out?
And I would take it one step further. It's not only Tillerson who's maybe on the way out, but if you're sitting in Pyongyang, it could also be Trump who's on the way out. They may have already written off this administration. They don't like the signs that they're getting from the administration on dialogue. The North Koreans are famous for outlasting American presidents.
What about the offer itself, like having the first talks for talks? What are your reactions to that?
Well, I think this is a classic effort by Ambassador Joseph Yun to try to de-escalate tension a bit and help to set the table for a constructive dialogue. And it's a really smart diplomatic maneuver because although the White House says that the North must pledge to denuclearize as a condition for talks, that condition might not apply if all you're doing is having talks about talks. So this is an effort by Joseph Yun to get an oar in the water, to begin to steer the diplomacy. I hope that the North Koreans would take him up on it, but he was just in Bangkok, Ambassador Jo Yun. The North Koreans were there in Bangkok at the same time, and they were unable to meet. So I'm afraid that initiative also may prove to be fruitless.
Jung, what are your thoughts about unconditional talks with North Korea?
What Secretary Tillerson said at the about no preconditions, about sitting down to talk about talks, it makes sense to me on the one hand. You have to get together and figure out who's going to be in the delegation, who's going to be representing North Korea and the United States. But it's, and as Frank mentioned, it's setting the table, but no one wants to come to the party. I'm not holding my breath on dialogue between the U.S. and North Korea. North Koreans have not said anything that suggested to me that they're ready to talk in meaningful dialogue about denuclearization, and Washington has clearly said that that we're not ready for that either. So I'm not holding my breath on talks.
Another interesting point that Tillerson revealed this week was that there is a high-level talks with China on the possible contingency plans regarding the instability in North Korea. So what is the level of coordination between Washington and Beijing on this issue?
Well, in years past, the Chinese were reluctant to talk at all, privately, publicly, off the record, didn't matter, about the North Korean contingency planning. And the fact that we now are speaking publicly about it and that the two governments are clearly coordinating at some level about how to handle a crisis is very encouraging because clearly if there is a war on the Korean Peninsula, China's going to be involved one way or the other, even if it's just controlling the border and managing refugees. But most likely the Chinese are going to be much more deeply engaged, and so it's essential that the United States and China talk. I don't know whether there's been a meeting of the minds between Beijing and Washington about how to handle such a crisis, but it's encouraging that they're speaking. It reduces the risk that you would see U.S. forces in conflict with Chinese forces in the event of a war on the peninsula.
Jung, United States never openly talked about this countermeasures against instability. So is this a pressure against North Korea by the fact that Secretary Tillerson said this in the open?
I wish we had more discussions about contingency planning. And I think that Tillerson's comment aside, there are some incremental movements. For example, this past week, there was the alleged leak into Chinese media about refugee camps being built around the border. So I would imagine that the Chinese are at least thinking about contingency planning. But as Frank said, the Beijing has been reluctant to talk about this for fear of angering North Korea any further, in any case.
Yeah, China worries if they start talking about the collapse of North Korea or a U.S. attack on North Korea openly, that the North Koreans essentially would say to the Chinese, what kind of a friend are you?
And also, I don't think that Beijing wants to encourage that kind of thinking in Washington either.
Good point.
Right, we'll wrap up our first discussion here and move on to our second topic.
전 세계의 평화와 안전을 위협하는 북핵 문제를 평화적으로 해결하고 한반도의 항구적인 평화를
中韩关系和朝鲜半岛形势
South Korean President Moon Jae-in was on a state visit to China this week. President Moon and Chinese President Xi Jinping agreed on 4 principles in dealing with North Korea: no war, denuclearization of the peninsula, pursuing dialogue, and improving inter-Korean relations. Now, Jung, let me give my first question to you. These 4-point agreement seems far from the tone of Washington emphasizing sanctions and pressures. What is your take on this?
I think it's important that President Moon is there talking to President Xi about North Korea. I don't see it as far removed as others might think. And I think it's important that President Moon is reiterating South Korea's centrality in dealing with the North Korea issue and making sure that Beijing is in lockstep on the North Korea approach.
Frank, South Korean centrality. Can South Korea play a major role between the United States and China and North Korea?
Well, you know, most American presidents get really nervous if they see our ally trying to be a balancer or an intermediary between the U.S. and China. I think President Moon here is really focused on economics. He's trying to repair the economic relationship between China and South Korea. Took a big hit when China imposed various kinds of restrictions on economics after the South Korean decision to deploy THAAD. I do think that there are people in Washington who are nervous about what President Moon is doing in terms of trying to strengthen ties to Beijing, but I think that nervousness is misplaced. The U.S. ought to welcome closer South Korean-Chinese cooperation on the North Korean problem. We can't solve the North Korean challenge without strong support from Beijing.
And it's not just on the North Korea issue. I also think that in that it's useful for and it's helpful for the international order and the rule of law and good governance for a player like South Korea that believes in all of those things and practices those things to be engaging with China to emphasize those points. So, while we talk a lot about the North Korea issue when we talk about South Korea and China, I think we all should remember that this is part of, we should encourage these dynamics between South Korea and China on those types of issues as well.
I agree with you, but I think that there is a concern in Washington that's likely to grow over time. If the South Koreans begin to lose faith in Washington as the principal driver of the North Korea policy, and if they start looking more and more to Beijing, then people in Washington are going to get nervous and they're going to get worried about a realignment. I don't think we're there yet.
What about also military alliance? Like China is against the deployment of THAAD and those three no's. So closer Seoul-Beijing relationship could hurt military alliance of the United States?
Closer South Korea relationship with Beijing will hurt the military alliance? I don't think so, but I think we're not doing as good a job as we can on alliance management. The UN ambassador Nikki Haley's comment about are considering pulling out of the Olympics that South Korea is hosting in February and March, and Senator Graham's comments about the likelihood of war and possibly a non-combatant evacuation out of South Korea. Those don't do anything to help support the alliance. And I think that would exacerbate the feeling in Washington and in Seoul about South Korea moving toward China, because Washington doesn't seem to be a credible partner.
It's a really key point. I mean, the idea that the United States might essentially be pushing South Korea more into China's camp rather than the other way around, with South Korea preferring it. Because I don't know of any South Korean leader who thinks that Beijing could ever replace or should ever replace the United States as the principal ally of South Korea.
And the South Korean public is not there. The polls, according to the polls, the South Korean public, their estimation of China is lower than their estimation of the Japanese, which had historically been high, right? Yes. I don't think the public is there on aligning closer to China. I don't think President Moon is there, but I do think that we could do a better job.
How about sanctions front? President Moon was expected to ask China to step up sanctions against North Korea, but there's no word on that. Frank, did he miss a good opportunity?
Well, I think China's probably done about as much as they're willing to do. And I think President Moon, again, had different priorities. I'm sure Washington hoped that he might underscore the sanctions message. But I think China already closed the Cross Yalu River Bridge, or at least for a couple of weeks, for maintenance. I think China is turning the screws on North Korea. So maybe President Moon simply didn't have that as a priority.
John, what are your thoughts that they didn't mention anything about sanctions against North Korea?
I agree with Frank that China is going to do as much as it wants to do on the North Korea issue. I think what people in Washington and elsewhere are fearing is how long can China or will China sustain these sanctions implementation. Sanctions against North Korea have never been sharper, and we need and require China's cooperation on this.
Well, we'll end this conversation here and move on to our next segment, the photo moment, a time to look at an interesting North Korea picture. Now, picture this week. North Korea held a high-level ceremony celebrating newly produced tractors and freight cars. This ceremony was held in Pyongyang's Kim Il-sung Square. After the ceremony, hundreds of tractors and freight cars are sent out throughout the country. Now, Frank, what is your reaction to this photo?
Well, we're used to photographs of missiles going through that square, and this is a brilliant reminder of the Byung-jin dual approach policy of North Korea. And the fact that we so often in the United States, we don't see these images. We sometimes forget that Kim Jong-un is as dedicated to strengthening the economy of his country, especially so that he can provide benefits for the elite in Pyongyang and party members, as he is in terms of strengthening their military. And it also gives me a little bit of hope, because the emphasis on economics shows that sanctions might bite and that they have an incentive to see the sanctions removed.
I agree with you, Frank. I also see this as a poke in the eye of the international community. Despite sanctions, we are creating and building our own tractors and trucks, and we're sending them out into the countryside. So it's a message to us as much as it is a manifestation of the Byung-jin policy.
Well, that's all the time we have for this week. Thank you for joining us, Jung and Frank.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And this was Washington Talk from VOA, and I'm Eunjung Cho. See you next week.